Hello and welcome to the Free Market Foundation, to all members of the media and other guests who have joined us today. Today we're going to talk about telecommunications, spectrum, data must fall and all topics relevant to that. And we're going to specifically look at government
and welcome
policy
to the Free Market
and how it has
Foundation,
affected
to all members
our
of the
lives
media
on a daily
and
basis.
other guests who have
The Free Market Foundation has undertaken a comprehensive in-depth research project into the impact of this policy and how things will go in the future. This is called the Socio-Economic Impact Assessment. It's a report that should accompany all proposed bills before they become legislation. We have two speakers today. One is Leon Lowe, the Free Market Foundation's founder and president. And our second speaker is Christopher Klein, who is a consultant specialist working in the ICT telecommunications space. He is defending his PhD next month on this topic, so we look forward to hearing from him. Now let's hear from Leon.
We have produced a socio-economic impact assessment, or a SEIA, on the government's telecommunications spectrum, which most people would know as cell phone policy. And that is done by us because we are amongst the world's leading experts. We introduced the concept to South Africa. It is now obligatory for every policy and law to be preceded by a SEIA, but so far no really high quality ones have been done in South Africa. This is the first one which can be regarded as a model, and it is on this all-important policy of broadcasting radio waves, TV, cell phones and more. Most importantly, South Africa has an extraordinary accomplishment, by far the biggest and most amazing accomplishment since 1994 in the new South Africa after apartheid. Started in the same year is the telecommunications or cell phone broadcasting network operators. The government created a duopoly, as it calls it, which was a silly thing to do at the time, and it now complains about its own so-called duopoly, two big operators. However, those two big operators ought to have a monument built to them. Vodacom and MTN have produced coverage in South Africa that is comparable with the best in the world. We are one of the highest rates of cell phone usage in the world. In fact, we have in South Africa nearly 2 active cell phones per person who's prospectively a cell phone user. So this is an amazing accomplishment, and this was done despite the government's bad policies, which were really extraordinarily bad by international standards. The government throttled them for spectrum. That is going to be explained afterwards by Christopher Klein. And the government expected them to produce low-cost telecommunications, especially data, when the government itself withheld the spectrum or wavelengths which are necessary to provide affordable and competitive data, and then produced a competition policy document saying that there was not sufficient competition in the market, even though we now have 6 operators where the government originally allowed only 2, and the government is considering bringing in a 7th one, which would be an extraordinary thing to do for a country like ours, where most countries in the world have much fewer than that. And in fact, if anything, we might be over-serviced. So what we have now is a set of policies in South Africa where the government has throttled the industry of the most valuable spectrum, the spectrum that is truly required for providing high-quality, low-cost services, because of so-called digital migration. Now, what that really means is that radio and TV are using the wavelengths which should be available and are available in other countries to mobile network operators or cell phone users, consumers. Our concern is the consumer in South Africa. We want the government to release radio waves. We want the government to unleash competition. We want the government to allow trade in spectrum or wavelengths. People can buy and sell and share and aggregate. That is what this socio-economic impact assessment concludes. I should also add that there is a terrible misunderstanding about the nature of competition. It is assumed that if there is market dominance or few operators, that there is not competition. This is a complete misunderstanding. Competition exists when markets are contestable. In other words, when anyone is free to enter the market. And so what we have in South Africa now is always two firms competing, contesting the market. Now we have 6, and if the government continues with a really silly idea of a 7th operator, the Wireless Open Access Network, or WOAN, then we will have 7. There is no useful purpose for such an addition to the market. It's my pleasure now to introduce Christoph Klein, who is our technical expert, to take us through the technical stuff, hopefully in a way that is accessible and comprehensible to lay people like me.
Hello, my name is Christoph Klein, and I'm now going to take you through the key findings of the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment, which I will refer to as SEIA in the following. When we structured this report, we asked ourselves 5 key questions, and these 5 key questions are at the same time indicative of what we're going to present right now, and also what the key content of the 5 main chapters of the SEIA document. The first question is whether there are technological facts, historical experiences, or theoretical economic considerations that support the view that spectrum is not owned by private market participants, that is, the parties that employ spectrum, because private ownership would inevitably lead to market failure. The second question is whether the policies, in particular the spectrum policies of the Department of Communication and Digital Technologies and ICASA obviously, have been conducive to achieving the socioeconomic goals of the South African population, so essentially the mobile user. The third question is going to be whether the policies of the public authorities actually stroke a balance between creating a conducive environment for the players in the industry, but also taking into account the socioeconomic government targets. Then the fourth question relates now to the current process of allocating spectrum, which has been put on hold right now, but we are hopeful that the process is going to continue within the next few months. So will the assignment of high demand spectrum create the conditions in future that the socioeconomic goals are better achieved than they have been so far? And then the fifth question is whether the spectrum policies right now, which allocate spectrum on an exclusive basis to carriers, will be conducive to what we're going to expect in the future of 5G and IoT markets, which means an enormous increase of traffic and capacity requirements in the future. So what you see on this slide is the structure of the SEIA on the left side and the structure of this presentation on the right side. They are basically identical with the exception that certain economic theory aspects are going to be treated a little bit later for, let's say, didactic reasons. It just better fits the flow. So what you see here that we're going to start with a short elaboration on what spectrum actually is. Then in the next part, we're going to actually talk about the current spectrum assignment in South Africa and compare that to what we see in other parts of the world. Then we're going to discuss a very important point, and this is the understanding of the government of what competition actually means and what they mean when they talk about open access. Then the fifth chapter is going to be a discussion on the assignment of the emergency spectrum and this planned spectrum auction. We're going to be quite detailed in that. And finally, we're going to have an outlook on what are the future requirements on spectrum assignment or spectrum allocation, if it's free market based, because of the technological movement that we're currently experiencing. So we now start with the second chapter, and we shortly address what spectrum actually is. The electromagnetic spectrum is the range of frequencies of electromagnetic radiation and their respective wavelength. Electromagnetic waves are emitted by electrically charged particles undergoing acceleration, and these waves can subsequently interact with other charged particles. So depending on the frequency and the energy with which a signal is emitted, we can hear, see, or feel specific waves. The bandwidth within which mobile operators can emit signals is the difference between the lowest and highest frequency in the spectrum. And what is important to know is that higher frequencies are very conducive for transporting high capacity data, and that lower frequencies are very conducive to covering large areas because of the specific propagation characteristics of waves. So what it effectively means is that if we are trying to download a Netflix movie in a dense urban area, we need high capacity, as many people do the same as you do at the same time, particularly during peak periods. So this means we need high capacity, and that's going to be achieved with spectrum in the 2.6 and 3.5 gigahertz band, ideally. These come with a problem. They have a very bad in building penetration because the waves are actually fading out much faster. To the contrary, in rural areas, I want to have low frequency because I can cover the same area with much less infrastructure. What you see on this slide is the relationship between using frequency in a specific band and the coverage area. What is important to understand now is that spectrum in lower frequency ranges, for example spectrum in the 700 or 800 megahertz band, allows mobile operators to cover far larger geographical areas compared to using spectrum in the higher frequency ranges of 1.8 or 2.1 gigahertz. MTN and Vodacom are still using the spectrum in the 1.8 and 2.1 gigahertz band, the last of which they received in 2005, so 16 years ago. Not having available spectrum in the 700, 800 megahertz bands comes with substantial economic implications. Then this comparison yields a very interesting number. You need 3 times as much infrastructure, ceteris paribus, so the same demand pattern, in order to cover the same area in rural areas. This spectrum is not available for South African carriers because the South African government has not completed the digital migration. So we say that this spectrum is dirty, so it's being used by broadcasters right now, so there is interference, and that limits their use for mobile services at this point in time. On this slide, it is illustrated how capital expenditures for network equipment increase with spectrum utilized in higher frequency bands. So, and this is the crucial point which also addresses one of the flaws in the market inquiry study of the ICASA. If we talk about prices in the mobile sector, we talk about effective prices. We're not talking about absolute prices. So effective prices means that you get more data for the same rand. And the third point of this short technical introduction, we're going to address a topic called carrier aggregation. So what carrier aggregation basically means is that spectrum in different frequency bands is combined. Without going into the technical details, the important thing to know is that it increases the efficiency of the network, and that particularly if you use LTE 700, 800 in urban areas, you create a much better in-building penetration. So as we are moving right now into the higher frequency space, because we have so high capacity needs in dense urban areas, this 700, 800 is of crucial importance. And as we speak right now, this is not available for the same reasons we just discussed a minute ago, that the digital migration has not been completed. So as you can see on the slide, the most common carrier aggregation combination is actually LTE 800 and LTE in the frequency band of 2.6 gigahertz. In South Africa, both of these bands are not available to Vodacom and MTN, so that 75% of the population that are more or less served by these two leading carriers do not actually enjoy the benefits of carrier aggregation, which comes at a socioeconomic cost. In the third chapter, we now first look at the current spectrum assignment in South Africa. And if you look at the table, what is quite astonishing is that MTN and Vodacom, the two leading carriers roughly serving 75% of the population, only have 27% of total spectrum. So the rest of the spectrum is assigned to Telkom, Rain, Liquid Telecom and Cell C. This is by itself already astonishing. What's even more astonishing is that MTN and Vodacom do not have spectrum in the bands of 700, 800, which is important for rural coverage, and in the bands of 2.3, 2.6 and 3.5, which is crucially important to produce data at lower prices in dense urban areas. This is unparalleled in the world. I'm not aware of any market where regulators have assigned such a low amount of spectrum to their leading carriers. In South Africa, MTN and Vodacom are the ones that provide geographical coverage to people and have the by far densest network footprint in urban areas. And not Telkom, for example, that disposes of almost double the spectrum of MTN and Vodacom combined. The question we have to address actually is, how did we get into this literally mess that the leading carriers have so little spectrum? And it's not the case that ICASA and the Department of Communication, or now the DCDT, did not try at times to release spectrum. But because of misconceived ideas of what competition is, the structure of the auctions or the allocation process of spectrum has met a lot of resistance from the carriers or failed from the very beginning. So 4 processes failed since roughly 2008, and now we're just experiencing that the 5th process at least is being put on hold because of interdicts by MTN and by Telkom that challenge for very good reasons the design of the current auction. ICASA has assigned spectrum to the so-called 2-tier carriers Liquid Telecom, Rain and Telkom in the 2.3 and 2.6 GHz band. But no spectrum has been made available in the 700, 800 MHz band and 2006 GHz band, which are the crucial bands to provide cost-effective rural coverage on the one hand and to produce cheaper broadband data in urban areas by employing carrier aggregation on the other. When looking at the table, we see that in most of SA's peer countries, carriers dispose of spectrum in both the digital dividend bands of 700, 800 MHz and the 2.6 GHz band. Given the extraordinary disadvantageous conditions under which MTN and Vodacom operate, they are quite likely to be among the global networks with the best network quality and geographical reach on a global basis. So we're coming to the same topics over and over again, actually, that the failed digital migration has imposed high socioeconomic costs on the South African population, and that data prices are higher than they would be if spectrum had been released. Again, the socioeconomic costs are due to the lack of digital dividend spectrum, which means that there is lower coverage in rural areas than otherwise would ensue. And secondly, we do not have the spectrum that's ideal to produce efficiently data in dense urban areas. And we will later see that the cost impact of this is massive. In the 4th chapter, we want to shed some light on the reasons why MTN and Vodacom have been denied spectrum for so long and why each of the attempts to auction spectrum during the past 15 years failed due to the massive resistance of MTN and Vodacom. For this, we have to understand that MTN and Vodacom have been systematically disadvantaged in each of the auction designs proposed by South Africa's regulatory authorities, either by excluding them from bidding for certain spectrum, by designing BE type of conditions that would have excluded them from the auction in the first place, by proposing to nationalize all spectrum used by current carriers and put it in a public entity, or as is the case of the pending auction that was planned to happen last month, by contriving a South African mobile market comprising Tier 1 and Tier 2 carriers. The reasons that underpin all of these policies we find in what SA's authorities regard as effective competition and open access markets. And there are 3 very simple rules that underpin the thought process of the government. The first is the more players, the better. The second is the less market share a single carrier has, the better. And the third point is infrastructure, so networks, towers, should be open access. The quote on this slide is taken from the market inquiry document. What ICASA first does is to cluster the national market into municipal markets, which by itself is a folly given the fact that neither the offerings of mobile network operators nor the networks can be meaningfully sliced along municipal boundaries. Note, for example, that a tower in the Karoo is worth nothing without the fiber network that carries the traffic to the central network, from where the traffic is carried to another municipality, maybe in Johannesburg even. What ICASA then did is to simply define that an operator is dominant when it has a market share exceeding 45% in more than 50 municipalities. So we must know that there are more than 200 municipal areas in South Africa. Hence, when a carrier ticks this box, the market is automatically defined as ineffectively competitive. This in turn is the basis on which ICASA derives its mandate to intervene into the market. Such an intervention can come in many shades, for example, by designing a spectrum auction in such a way that puts perceived dominant carriers at a disadvantage in bidding for spectrum. And this is exactly what underpins the upcoming auction regime by artificially splitting the market into groups of Tier 1 and Tier 2 carriers. So what does it mean in effective legal terms when the government speaks about ineffective competition? It means 45. 45% is the threshold in the competition law as of which somebody is being considered as dominant, and being dominant means that markets are failing. The government actually provides no reason for this 45%, so there is no intellectual underpinning based on which this number could be derived. So this we could compare to the famous 42 from Douglas Adams' The Hitchhiker's Guide Through Galaxy. 42 is the answer supercomputer Deep Thought gave to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything after 7.5 million years of computing. So the problem now in the novel is that no one knows what the question was. As to the regulatory number 45%, we actually know what the question is. What is effective competition? But here we face another problem. 45% is a wrong answer. There is no scientific reason that supports the 45%. First of all, it ignores that Telkom and Cell C are able to go to any municipality in South Africa and erect their own towers and radio base stations instead of roaming on MTN's or Vodacom's networks. For very good commercial reasons, Telkom, for example, concentrates on rolling out LTE 4G infrastructure, not least because they have spectrum in the 2.3 and even in the 3.5 gigahertz bands, which allow them to produce data more cost effectively. The idea of open access was first elaborated on by the DOC in their policy white paper that was published in 2016. And in this white paper, they list 5 criteria that are important for a market to be open or for an open access regime to prevail. And the first criterion they actually list is openness. So the rather amusing thing is that there is no definition of openness. There are 4 other criteria. It's transparency. They don't define transparency. The next is equal access and non-discrimination. This is a particularly important point because what they mean by this is that other carriers could access, for instance, Vodacom's and MTN's infrastructure through regulatory interdict. What this means essentially is that other carriers have access rights to other people's property. This is not normally what we want to have in our private lives. Let's have a look and read through the definition of non-discrimination. So all access seekers must be granted access to networks in a non-discriminatory manner. A vertically integrated infrastructure provider cannot favor services affiliated with its own company. So my answer to that is, of course they can, because that's what we do in everyday life. When we acquire and own property, we obviously use it to our best knowledge and to our benefit. And as to the matter of non-discrimination, the whole idea of competition is to discriminate as best as possible between different users of resources. So this is the very basis of economics. And if the government thinks they can remove non-discrimination by enforcing access of third parties to private property, then this will always meet resistance by the current owners of assets. And this is what we see on an everyday basis in the mobile telecommunication sector. So we have now established what the government authorities' ideas of effective competition and open access are. The important question we now have to ask is whether the policy proposals that are based on these ideas actually meet the criterion of evidence-based policymaking. So is there any scientific underpinning or historical empirical experience that support their ideas? And here we clearly have to say no. If we look at what has been happening in the markets of mobile carriers, we have seen that lots of elements of their value chain that they used to own as a vertically integrated carrier have been carved out by competitors. In the top section of the graph, we see the traditional value chain of a vertically integrated carrier. So what they did, they produced GSM voice and SMS services when they started up, and essentially they owned all network assets, including the content and the customer interface. In the part below, this more or less started in 2010, certain parts of the value chain moved to third parties. Here particularly, of course, the content that's being produced by so-called over-the-top providers, so the Apples, Netflix, Facebooks, and so on. So carriers actually do not own the content anymore. They intermediate the content. This is a crucially important step because it takes away a lot of market power from MNOs. On the left side of the graph, we see the asset impact, where towers have been outsourced, where fiber to the base station is being provided by other companies, and there are lots of other things like a decentralized data center and other aspects on which carriers are being contested. In the bottom section, we see what's happening right now, and this is a trend that will be reinforced by market forces. So on the left side, we see the contestable area that's basically going to go to specialized infrastructure providers. And on the right side, we see the contestable area that's going to sit not only with OTT providers, but also with the upcoming IoT providers. So the core domain of the MNOs is shrinking as we speak. And as said, with the introduction of 5G and IoT, the carriers will struggle to defend their turf. So everybody in the carrier space is aware about this, and one of the biggest threats here are the so-called hyperscalers, the Amazons, Microsofts, Facebooks, and Googles that have lots of financial power to buy infrastructure themselves and to distribute their content on a global basis. In the market inquiry study on data prices, regulator ICASA took a very narrow view on what they consider the relevant markets. So first they looked at the retail market, so the consumer, and they looked at certain pieces of infrastructure. But does this narrow view actually reflect what's going on in the overall ITC value chain? So the first question is, what are technology trends that are being imposed on carriers that they have no control over? As an example, for instance, if Vodacom implements LTE radio and they can provide much higher data speeds, then MTN is forced to do the same. So it's not that they can just choose what they would like to do, because consumers actually ask for higher data throughput, and this is what carriers have to comply with. This is a consumer verdict. So what we see here is that the mobile network operator, depicted in the middle of the graph, acts as a technology aggregator on behalf of the consumer. There are 5 market player groups whose technological inventions mobile operators integrate into their networks and whose services they intermediate. On the technology side, new radio standards in combination with antenna technology have hugely increased data throughput. Powerful chip technology is what our smartphones need to receive signals from a dozen of different radio standards. And then finally, there would be no reason for this progress if we were not to use it for demanding ever more data content, mostly video streaming. The single mobile carrier operating in South Africa or any other market does have very limited influence on what happens on the technological side of the ecosystem. They merely employ what helps them to deliver the best consumer experience, provided they are not hamstrung by regulators. So what we actually see, if we look back to the 1990s, where they started as producers of their own services, voice, GSM voice and SMS services, to more or less 2010, 2015 as technology aggregators, where do they move in 2030? What is the trajectory actually the mobile network carriers are going to go? And not few are of the view that they might disintegrate into the cloud if they are unable to hold their customer relationship with the consumers. So their biggest asset right now as we speak is that they have a large retail footprint in the market, know their customer, and this is their biggest asset. The asset is not in infrastructure, and most of this infrastructure has been outsourced already, and more will be outsourced in future. As an example, roughly 2/3 of all towers on the African continent are already with independent tower company operators. The answer to the question now, whether the regulators' policies meet the criterion of evidence-based policymaking, is a resounding no. If we look at the graph here, then we see 4 pressure areas that all come down on the MNOs as we speak right now. There are 3 market forces and 1 other force, which we come in a minute. The first force is simply coming from consumers. This is the retail market pressure. Consumers are essentially agnostic. They don't care actually about 4G, 5G data standards or carrier aggregation. They want to have fast data, cheap data, and high throughput. So this creates dynamics in its own. The second force is technology pressure. So if there's new technologies that can give MNOs a short-lived competitive edge, they're going to implement it. And this is what they do. And it's a race that has been astonishing during the last 25 years if we look back how it all started off. The third point is what I call a value chain pressure. These are companies that try to carve out elements in the value chain that used to be with the carriers. So essentially this is specialization, and if companies specialize, this means they can produce the same service that carriers used to produce more cheaply. This is going to be to the benefit of consumers. In addition to the 3 market pressures, there's 1 non-market pressure, and this is the regulatory political pressure. This pressure comes from the political arena. Such pressures may refer to socioeconomic goals, for example, the achievement of the best possible rural coverage at affordable prices. There is nothing wrong about such goals as long as it is understood that carriers, as all other economic entities at every second of their lives, operate under resource constraints. In other words, socioeconomic goals do not materialize simply because politicians think they should. The problem ensues if governments unleash a frenzied regulatory activism while forgetting that they first have to create the conditions for such goals to materialize. And this is exactly the problem with our government. They have well-justified socioeconomic goals, such as cheaper data and higher rural coverage, but they fail to create the regulatory conditions for mobile operators to work towards achieving these goals. In the case of South Africa, the subject of this presentation, it is the failure to make available spectrum in the digital dividend band, important for better rural coverage, and in the 2.3, 2.6 and 3.5 gigahertz bands, which is needed to produce more cost-effectively broadband data. Finally, we have to ask the question, do we actually need a WOAN? So the graph you see in front of you depicts the current market structure in South Africa. And what we're seeing here is in the right top corner, MTN and Vodacom are the leading carriers. They procure wholesale roaming services from two other carriers, Liquid and Rain, on an arm's length principle. So this basically means they use infrastructure of other companies in order to complement their network or provide better services, because these companies have spectrum that Vodacom and MTN have been denied. Cell C is slowly morphing into a mobile virtual network operator, which means that they will not have own infrastructure assets in the long run. They do that currently through the MTN network, through a roaming agreement. Telecom benefits from Vodacom's large geographical footprint. If that were not the case, they couldn't serve customers in rural areas as the ex-incumbent. That would be an embarrassment, so they benefit mostly from these roaming agreements and the infrastructure footprint of Vodacom. So if we look at this market structure, what we see is that all the carriers are actually cooperating with each other by sharing their resources. They have been converging toward a network that is commonly used and the benefits of which the consumers enjoy in South Africa. So the question is, do we actually need another WOAN? Or, to rephrase the question, maybe we might have a WOAN already, a market-based WOAN. It is our firm conviction that we don't need a WOAN because we already have created one. This market-based WOAN has been created through voluntary commercial agreements between mobile operators. Nobody has forced Cell C and Telkom to roam on MTN's or Vodacom's networks. To the extent that the budget constraints we face in the ordinary course of our daily economic activity are considered as unfair or unequal, this largely is a personal problem. I can be unhappy about my neighbors driving expensive cars, but I cannot just force them to share their cars with me. What I can do is to earn the funds that afford me to buy the same. Let us now see on which economic basis the WOAN is planned to be established. Here we have to look at the design of the spectrum auction as laid out in the invitation to apply published by ICASA. The key point you see on the slide: for MNOs to be able to participate in the spectrum auction, they are compelled to offtake 30% of the capacity of the WOAN once it is being established. In other words, the government wants to create a seventh carrier by forcing the 6 existing carriers to buy a fixed share of the WOAN's overall traffic. In the ITA document, you find this under the term incentive, which is a euphemism for coercion. The question to ICASA is why they have to force other carriers to buy traffic when the WOAN is so desperately needed. Apart from this, there is no international evidence that the creation of such artifacts do anything good to consumers, let alone to improve competition. We're now coming to the 5th chapter, which deals with the emergency spectrum assignment and the planned spectrum auction. So, as to the emergency spectrum allocation, you can see in the graph that most of the spectrum that has been allocated on a temporary basis could actually not be used. First of all, we have to understand that all the spectrum in the 700, 800 band is what we call dirty. It means it's currently being used by broadcasters and can only be employed by carriers to a very limited extent. So radio engineers from MTN and Vodacom will confirm you that on a national basis, this cannot be used to the benefit of the population. So after running a few tests with that spectrum, they essentially have abolished further rollout into this area. We see that the spectrum allocated to MTN and Vodacom in the bands 2.3, 2.6 and 3.5, which is important to produce efficient broadband data, has not been employed before. What this means is essentially that Vodacom and MTN have never operated radio infrastructure in these frequency bands. So this comes with an important implication. Based on temporary spectrum, would you implement infrastructure for billions of US dollars, knowing that you don't own it, but this is only granted on a temporary basis? Still, it has to be lauded that Vodacom and MTN rolled out a couple of hundred base stations in the 2.6 gigahertz band, because this is what they were most urgently lacking. The assignment of emergency spectrum demonstrated two things. First of all, spectrum is readily available. So it has been de-hoarded and made available to carriers who immediately started to employ the spectrum for network rollout purposes, at least in certain bands. Secondly, it confirmed that spectrum can be assigned in a non-bureaucratic fashion. So there is no need for prolonged and complex spectrum auction processes, just release it. In the following table, we see the planned spectrum assignment and the spectrum that has been dedicated to the WOAN. So it's a total of 406 megahertz, of which 80 megahertz is reserved for the WOAN. So 326 megahertz of spectrum across all the bands you can see in the table will be given to carriers. There are, however, two important provisos. First of all, the spectrum in the digital dividend band 700, 800 is dirty, as we discussed before. So Telecom in the interdict actually have a point. Why should they pay for something that cannot be used? So this is actually not the real reason for Telecom's interdict, because otherwise Vodacom and MTN would have raised the same point, but they are not concerned with paying spectrum fees for spectrum that they cannot immediately use. For MTN and Telecom, the most important point is that the spectrum is out of the door of ICASA and in the hands of carriers, which would then also put a lot of pressure on the regulatory authorities to complete the digital migration process. Telecom, for that matter, uses this point as a pawn to disrupt the spectrum process, because they fear, justifiably so, that by granting additional 326 megahertz of spectrum, the competitive position will get much more difficult in future for Telecom than it is already. In the provisions that lay out the rules and general structure of the auction, ICASA defines the Tier 1 MNO as one that is a wholesale national operator that has a retail market share in excess of 45% in more than 10 municipalities. A Tier 2 carrier is defined as a wholesale national operator that has a retail market share below 45% in less than 10 municipalities, which is hilarious because this definition would put MTN and Vodacom also in the Tier 2 group, because they surely have below 45% in less than 10 municipalities. What we now learn is that the market inquiry study contains the definitions that underpin the auction design. The definition of Tier 1 and Tier 2 carriers excludes Tier 1 carriers from accessing certain amounts of spectrum which are reserved for Tier 2 carriers before the actual auction process will happen. This is what is defined as the opt-in scheme in the auction ITA. In the 700, 800 megahertz band, this is not a major problem. The problem ensues in the bands of 2.6 and 3.5. So in the original ITA, it was actually only mentioned that the 100% opt-in reserve for the Tier 2 carriers would apply to the 2.6 gigahertz spectrum. As there will be 140 megahertz of spectrum in the 2.6 bands, 40 would have been left to Vodacom and MTN. This is not a lot, but they could have survived the scenario, particularly given the fact that they will strike roaming agreements with other carriers. Retrospectively so, in a press conference, ICASA confirmed that the opt-in quantum of 100 megahertz actually applies to 2.6 and 3.5 frequency band. What this means is that if tier 2 carriers chose to use 86 megahertz of the total 100 megahertz they are eligible to opt in for, both bands of 2.6 and 3.5 gigahertz, no spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band would be left for the two tier 1 carriers to bid for in the auction. This could create a situation in which Vodacom and MTN, the two leading carriers serving 75% of the population, are left without any spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band. Spectrum in this band is crucial for the future of IoT and 5G services. So denying the most important carriers in a country this spectrum is probably unparalleled again on a global basis. And this is the reason behind MTN's legal action, which is well justified given the importance for the future of their position in the market and the socioeconomic benefits of the population. And when we talk about the South African population, we talk about the consumer and their benefit. We now want to take a short excursion into the history of spectrum use and regulation. This is important to understand the principal logic of the current regulatory system, which in turn serves to make intelligible the failures of the regulatory authorities, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. Is there anything with spectrum that makes it a particular resource that requires a different economic or regulatory treatment from all the other resources we employ on a daily basis? And actually there is nothing that would warrant this view. So if we look back into the history of spectrum assignment, it started off in the 1920s in the United States when the world's first broadcasters went on air. And when they had interference cases, they settled these cases on a private arbitration basis. In 1926, the Oak Leafs legal decision established private spectrum property rights. This was a blow to the Hoover administration, in particular the military complex, which wanted to assume control over spectrum and declared a national resource. In order to attain this goal, the Hoover administration passed legislation that guaranteed each spectrum applicant a broadcasting license in the spectrum band they chose to operate in at no cost. And this is the decisive point, regardless of whether or not some broadcasters were already operating in the chosen frequency band. It was this decision that led to the interference and alleged market chaos that regulatory authorities quote on their homepages to explain their mandate to the layman until these days. In essence, it was a violation of existing property rights that caused the interference. It was no market failure, as one would read in the typical textbooks until these days. Having talked about the history of spectrum assignment, we now have to talk about what spectrum actually is in terms of its economic properties. And what we often hear is that spectrum is a scarce and finite resource. So what does it actually mean to ask whether something is a scarce resource? Essentially, it's a tautology because it wouldn't be a resource if it were not scarce. The key point is that in a free market, that is, under conditions of voluntary exchange, there is a price in the first place. It is market prices that inform market participants about relative levels of scarcity. And the perceived level of scarcity is a subjective or individual matter. What might be expensive for person A might be cheap for another person B, not necessarily because B has a higher income. It may also be the case that A earns a higher income but does not attach as high a value to the good as B. In the case of spectrum, we do not have a market in the first place. If spectrum is auctioned off, such auction prices are not market prices because after the auction, spectrum cannot be traded. Spectrum is still a matter of exclusive assignment. The consequence of the absence of markets is that resources not only become particularly scarce, the allocation of publicly administered goods is particularly dismal, for which the public spectrum assignment in South Africa is a prime example. Then, as to the notion of finite spectrum or the finiteness of resources, this is economically meaningless because technically speaking, all resources are finite. It is the task of entrepreneurs to work towards making resources less finite. So more spectrum in the 700, 800 megahertz bands would allow mobile operators to produce the same data output with much less infrastructure. As a consequence, the finiteness of mobile data is reduced by employing spectrum in frequency bands that are technically more efficient than the one carriers currently use. In summary, the question is whether the specific nature of spectrum warrants a different treatment as compared to other resources. And the answer is no. Spectrum is as special and as unique as all other resources. The same economic principles of entrepreneurial resource allocation apply as to all other resources such as cars, milk, or oil. And there is no reason to assume market bands why would market more efficient not find than the workable exchange mechanisms to allocate the immensely valuable resource spectrum when they succeed in the allocation of possibly even far more critical resources. For example, resources in the production of HIV treatment or solar panels works fine. The history between 1920 and 1926 actually confirmed that market-based spectrum allocation worked well. So we are coming now to the 6th chapter, which provides a very brief outlook on the future requirement of spectrum utilization, not only from a regulatory perspective, but also from an MNO perspective. Many of the listeners might remember the heated discussion of the so-called net neutrality debate, during which many politicians feared that an internet was about to emerge, which would lead to a slow, under-resourced internet for the poor and one for the rich, whose throughput would be prioritized based on income or willingness to pay. So the idea was that there should be no discrimination of user groups, for instance in terms of price or in terms of capacity, and that there should be homogeneous pricing. If we now look at what's going to be required to accommodate the needs of the 5G world and IoT services, which you can see in the graph, particularly in terms of mission-critical services, and we are not only talking about the famous case of autonomous driving, where we will need very low latencies, we also talk about industrial steering processes or about medical applications. So the key principle in the future 5G and IoT world effectively is please discriminate me. And because of the very high bandwidth these applications will require, we will have a much more fluid network infrastructure. So this has very important implications for the allocation of spectrum, because so far spectrum is being assigned by the regulator on an exclusive use basis. So carriers are actually not allowed to share spectrum. This is very anachronistic mechanism, because in the future, when we will allocate spectrum on a capacity basis, we have to share the spectrum among carrier boundaries. And we have to share the spectrum according to peak traffic. And we have to allocate the traffic to the users where they are most important. And this also means that people will pay for quality of services. And as per the current regulatory regime, we would not achieve that. For the consumer to reap the benefits of the future IoT and 5G world, we need to have a much more flexible regime of spectrum allocation, and certainly regulatory regime as we experience to share spectrum right now will not accommodate these needs. So this concludes my part, and I now hand over back to Leon for the final presentation of results.
This here, which is the most important document on the subject, makes it clear that we need a more flexible spectrum policy and allocation, including that spectrum should be tradable and shareable, and that the digital migration should be concluded and all of the wavelengths or spectrum should be made available, not so much to service providers but to consumers. South African consumers deserve a better deal and deserve the government to stop throttling their access to network services. It's also time for us to join the rest of the world, where there is the greatest example, the first example since the war really, of privately owned and operated and competitive infrastructure, and it's an incredible success story. In South Africa, as I said in the beginning, we have nearly 200% or 2 mobile phones per user, which is, puts us amongst the world's top half dozen users. And this is in spite of the government's bad policies over the past 15 years. It's time now to move to sound policies, market-related policies, and the SEER shows that. The SEER is freely available, it's downloadable, hard copies can be acquired at a nominal price, but it is something that should be the basis of all future policy. We should also understand that the network providers, the first 2, which the government created a duopoly, created the conditions for collusion. Fortunately for South Africans, they didn't collude, they competed and produced one of the greatest success stories, perhaps the greatest success story of the new South Africa. What we also learn from the SEER is that the anti-competition policy of the so-called Competition Commission has been counterproductive, and there needs to be a more sophisticated, theoretically legitimate understanding of what competition is and how it functions. And we'll close with referring back to the 5 questions that were posed at the beginning and informed the SEER all the way through. And the answer to all 5 questions is no, 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 no. So let's move forward on the basis of a modern, efficient network system that will give consumers who use cell phones and data and the internet and other users, broadcasting, TV and so on, world-class services which we have been denied until now. Thank you for your attention. We will now go into the question and answer session led by Jane Boccoglione.
Hello, and thank you very much, Leon and Christoph. And to the viewers and listeners, that was quite a lengthy video, and thank you very much for your attention. And it's a controversial and complex subject, and we've tried to cover it in detail, but I'm sure that there are many questions that want to come in. Please either come online and pose them personally or put them in the chat box and I can read them out. Thank you.
Probably read them from the chat box. I think there are questions.
Yeah. You seem to have a bit of a technical...
You also got some by email, I think.
Yes. Okay, let's start with some of the questions that I have received. ICASA and the Competition Commission, why have they given no idea, i.e. quantification, of what they expect the effects of these policies to be? Why do you think that is? Because we understand that they haven't given any quantification.
Maybe I can respond to that. Obviously, you can also, Jane and Christoph. But this is really what the purpose of a SEER is, a socio-economic impact assessment, which is now compulsory for all laws and policies in South Africa. One of the requirements of a properly done SEER is that it must provide quantification. It has to say 2 things must be quantified. One is, what's the problem? Why do you want it? What's called in law the mischief principle. What is the problem you want to solve when you introduce a new policy or law? So you must quantify it. What exactly is the issue that you want to redress? Then the next thing you have to qualify in a socio-economic impact assessment. It shouldn't really require one. It should be normal when all policies and laws are proposed, but it makes it more formal and makes it compulsory in a SEER. And that is, what is the outcome you expect? You've got to quantify how many new services, what prices do you expect to change? How would consumers be affected? The obsession at the moment with suppliers, providers, is a misconception. We should be concerned about consumers. What is the best way to serve consumers? And if consumers choose to support one single supplier, Pick and Pay or Macro or Woolworths or whatever it is, then that is the consumer's right. Consumers vote with their hands. So what we should do is have a SEER where it is quantified, where the Competition Commission, the ICASA and the departments say, the purpose of this policy is to bring about the following change, which they should then spell out, be specific, quantify. And then one can monitor that and see, did it have the desired effect? And if it doesn't have the desired effect, you go back to the drawing board. And I see some politicians, for example, in with us. That's great. You then go back to the drawing boards and say the objective as defined wasn't achieved. What do we do now? What do we do instead? Do we just scrap what we tried, or do we try something else?
Okay, thank you very much, Leon. If anyone has a further point on that, please do come forward. Another question is, if we have 98% coverage, why is the government in ICASA saying that there is not enough in rural areas? Perhaps that's one for you, Christoph.
Can you repeat that? You are very mute, Jane.
It is said that we have 98% coverage in South Africa. Why then do ICASA and the government say there's not enough in the rural areas? What's going on there?
So the point here is that 98% coverage refers to coverage in all bands. So it's mainly 3G, and 3G doesn't give you the good experience you would like to have in terms of throughput and general quality if you are on the internet. So the problem here is that 4G LTE cannot be implemented cost effectively, and the reason for this is that the digital dividend spectrum in the 700, 800 megahertz bands haven't been released yet. And this makes it very costly to cover large rural areas. And South Africa obviously is a very big country. And once the digital migration is completed, and in many countries this has been done, then rural LTE rollout on a large scale will immediately commence. So in Germany, for instance, there have been obligations on carriers using 700, 800 spectrum to first roll out in the rural areas before they can actually use that in urban areas.
Okay, thank you very much. We have more questions coming in. It seems to be that ICASA, the Government Competition Commission, seem to think about the markets would work better without big players. What about economies of scale? Why are they pushing it this way?
So the question is that, or the point is that markets would work better with no big players.
That seems the ethos from ICASA and government that markets should not have the big players. Is that the correct?
So in essence, we're talking about very high investments here, and we must remember that when the 1990s first mobile networks were rolled out, there was huge uncertainty because they started off on a postpaid basis. So I have seen business cases in my function as consultant that never went beyond 10% penetration in countries like South Africa, because in a postpaid scheme, you needed to produce a credit vetting. So 3 salary slips, you had a proof of residence and obviously a bank account, and like 80% of the world population did not have that in the 1990s, and still many don't have that today. So these large investments naturally could only be shouldered by very large companies. So this is more an empirical explanation. In terms of economic theory, actually, there's nothing that would justify a claim in either direction. So you could have a market actually with only little players, and there are many markets in the world where you only have, let's say, what you call atomistic competition, like, you know, in milk production or something like this. Yeah, you don't have big players. Yeah. And in network industries, they are more conducive to large entities. But from an economic theory perspective, there's no reason why there should only be large or why there should only be small enterprises.
Thank you. Leon, do you have anything to add to that, or has Christoph covered it?
So I would just add that there's a lot of mythology about suppliers. Everyone carries on and on obsessively about suppliers instead of what is in the interests of consumers. It's quite important to understand that if consumers support a big supplier, for example, Macro or Woolworths or Pick n Pay or ShopRite, and small suppliers, the local corner store and grocery store and so on, that is the consumer's right and the consumer's choice. You should not have a competition policy or a government policy that says some are better than others. That is not for them to say, it's for consumers to say. And then there are some activities like hairdressers or plumbers or carpet cleaners or whatever, where you tend to have only small operators. And then there are some where you tend to have only big operators, for example, international airlines or television stations. So there is no optimal, as Christoph says, economic theory. The economic theory is what's called contestability theory. All that you need is for the market to be freely contestable, where anybody can enter or leave or cooperate, which is wrongly sometimes called collude, have joint ventures or cooperation. That is what consumers want, to be able to decide for themselves which suppliers they want to support. And this should not be a matter of policy, and there should not be people trying to play omniscient and omnipotent governors who know better than consumers. Nobody knows better than a consumer. Only the consumer knows, and only the consumer should decide. It should be what the famous South African economist William Hutt called consumer sovereignty. The consumer should be sovereign. And that is we in the Free Market Foundation, generally our approach is about the rights and interests of consumers. And this constant obsession with the structure of the market or the conduct of players or whether or not they cooperate is missing the point completely, that the purpose of competition is consumers, and we should get out of the way and let them choose which suppliers they want, big or small, local or international. It should be a consumer right.
Thank you very much, Leon. My apologies to the listeners. I'm getting messages saying that my sound is muffled. I'm sorry about that. If it becomes too difficult to hear me, then I'll hand over the questions to Leon or another member of our team. There's a question here. Where should government start in fixing the spectrum delay issue? Is your recommendation? What is your recommendation? What are the priority areas? Perhaps that's one for you, Christoph.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question, and this is a digital dividend spectrum. So far, even if the spectrum had been auctioned off in March this year in the 700, 800 band, the carriers couldn't have used it because it's dirty. We explained that in the presentation. So the government has to fast track the migration of broadcasters that still use hugely valuable spectrum for rather benign analog broadcasting services in many rural areas and provinces, and move them to the lower frequency digital bands, which, by the way, is also much more effective from their perspective, and unfreeze the spectrum, because with this you would kill two birds with one stone. First of all, you could roll out much more cheaply LTE infrastructure in rural areas, and secondly, you could apply carrier aggregation, which is a very important technique to optimize network throughput, among many other advantages in urban areas, and that would then ceteris paribus also lead to lower effective prices. And yeah, this is my key answer is not fundamentalistic in a way, immediately liberalize all spectrum and let it trade. The first step is really to get the digital migration done.
If I may come in over there, please, Jane. This was meant to have been concluded by international agreement with the International Telecommunications Authority by 2015. And then ever since then, we've been told it's about to happen, it's about to happen. The latest was in President Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address, where he said it would now be concluded a year from now, by March next year. Well, let's wait and see. But the point is, we are sitting here with a dinosaur analog system, which is wasting important wavelengths, airwave spectrum, that could be and should be used to serve, again, consumers. Consumers are being denied access to the most optimal spectrum. They are getting radio and TV, but by old-fashioned moribund dinosaur technology, which we have been promised since the early 2000s, or 2010 on, really, and now been promised again by next March. Well, let's see. Let's hope that this time it happens. It's quite complicated how to do. It's technologically complicated. So it's easy to say it must be done, which is what I've just done, but it should have received the necessary high-tech attention from 2010 on. Certainly by 2015, it should have been completed.
Yeah, Leon, let me comment on that a little bit more. This is the perfect example why spectrum should be tradable, because until, let's say, approximately the early 2010s, spectrum was there was technology-specific regulations. So you could only, for instance, use a broadcasting spectrum for broadcasting. But this is a folly. There's no economic reason why this should be the case, because obviously it can be used for TV broadcasting or for mobile services. So if these benign broadcasters in the analog space could have traded off their spectrum to the mobile carriers, they would have earned 100-fold of their company's worth. And this shows you that the case-by-case or command and control spectrum policy is from a market perspective, or I wouldn't even say market perspective, it's against common sense. It imposes enormous socioeconomic costs, and it destroys incentives, because obviously now the analog broadcasters, they don't have the resources, because they are simply not profitable to move and to the lower frequencies and buy the radio equipment that is needed. Yeah, and to accommodate that, at least in some countries like the United States and also Brazil, when they bid it off 700, 800 spectrum, they actually reserved that money, the proceeds, to give it to the analog broadcasters for them to be able to pay the investment costs that are required. So we see here how top-down spectrum policies destroy incentives and through this impose socioeconomic costs that could have been avoided 7, 8, like 10 years ago. Not only 2015, many countries got that done actually before 2015.
Sorry, Jane, I don't want to take up too much time with Christoph and me, but there is a very important point, and I apologize to people with many questions that follow. But it is important for everybody, and I encourage everybody to look up the Coase theorem, C-O-A-S-E, from the Nobel Prize-winning economist Ronald Coase, who made the observation that any resource, all resources, it doesn't really matter what the initial allocation is, who has them, whether they're big or small, or whether they're old or new or whatever. What brings about efficient and optimal usage of all resources, all capital, all wealth, all technology, all labor, is tradability. In other words, you can almost just sort of throw the dice at the beginning, and it doesn't matter who gets what, as long as they can trade it away to somebody who bids them, who makes a better bid. And the Coase theorem is what should have been in operation with spectrum in South Africa since the 2010s or even before.
Thank you very much, Leon. I think that's a very important point to make. Another question here. It's quite a lengthy question, and some of it may already have been answered. Nevertheless, I will read it all out. The NDP observes spectrum policy should favor competition, but incumbents should not be excluded from gaining access to bands needed for expansion or to apply new technologies. The question is it possible to design a spectrum auction stroke assignment that seeks to address all of these? Can we realistically please everyone? ICASA is appealing, ICASA seems to recognize this, that you can't please both big and smaller players. Do you have a comment on that?
Yes. So first of all, I would say this is a catch-22, because obviously there is no right or clearly laid out solution. What is interesting in the question is that ICASA, as per the ITA, indeed seems to have realized that they can't achieve their socioeconomic targets by continuing to punish, essentially, or withhold spectrum from the two leading carriers. Yeah. So obviously, this has an implication, particularly for telecom and Cell C, not so much for liquid and rain, because these are not consumer facing, or rain, they do have a certain market, but it's rather negligible. So indeed, the point is that telecom would obviously lose ground in the market, and but this is independent of the auction scheme. It would happen in any case, because I'm asking, on which basis would telecom in fact be able to compete with MTN and Vodacom, given that they have a much smaller network footprint? So far, their biggest advantage is that they have spectrum in bands that are far more efficient to apply in urban areas than MTN and Vodacom. So you could argue that telecom actually has an unfair regulatory advantage, because they own spectrum the other players were denied, and that way they can more efficiently provide urban broadband services. So there is no, to cut a long story short, there is no clear answer to the question. But yes, indeed, ICASA seems to have a realization that they have to work with MTN and Vodacom, and yeah, this what makes it actually very disappointing that now this interdict is happening and is delaying the spectrum auction, because we must see one thing, and Leon is making this point all the time. We have to think about this from the perspective of the consumer and not from the perspective of legal entities. The consumer is agnostic. He doesn't care from whom he does receive broadband or with whom he has a contract. It's like washing powder. It's pretty homogeneous these days, because you stream either a gigabit from MTN or from Telecom. It doesn't make a difference. So the spectrum should go to the companies that are best suited actually to provide the best services. It doesn't matter how many players are in the market, or whether a player like Telecom has a market share of 15, 17 or 21%, or whether MTN has 44% or 46% or 39%. This is all from an economic perspective completely irrelevant.
Okay, thank you. Leon, anything to add, or is that covered it?
No, that covers it. I'm concerned about later questions, which I also see in the chat. So let's move on. We can chat about each of these issues is itself a full-length workshop or seminar. So we have to try and cut it short and move on.
Leon, on that point, is there a particular question you would like to answer from the chat box that you're looking at? I've lost your sound.
Leon is on mute.
Oh, my apology, I'm on mute. I do see a question there from Nkobile, who asks, do you think ICASA has grounds for an appeal, and will they win or not? I don't know if Christoph has a view on that. I'd like to know it.
Christoph, grounds for appeal. Do you think ICASA has grounds for appeal against MTN and Telkom?
So actually not, because Telkom obviously has a point when they say, how can you auction off something for billions of rands if you can't use it? And they're referring to the dirty spectrum in the 800 band, which will only become fully utilizable after the digital migration has been finished. So this is a fair point, and obviously all the other carriers, they have realized the same. So it's completely obvious. And you asked yourself how you could design an auction actually without attending to this absolutely obvious issue that the players would contest actually paying spectrum fees for something they can't use. The point here is MTN and Vodacom, they don't care, because the most important thing is that the spectrum is out of the door of ICASA, that it's in the market. And this was also the important thing about the emergency spectrum. Yeah, they pay their spectrum fees because they want to have released it, not because they can use it, because this imposes then in the following a pressure on ICASA to vacate the bands for which then all the carriers actually pay. On the matter of MTN's appeal, I think this refers to the so-called opt-in scheme. We refer to it in the presentation, and I don't want to go into the technical detail. It is a little bit technical, but we just have to understand the consequences. The consequence would be that if the tier 2 carriers opt in for the full 86 megahertz available, or which ICASA will make available in the 5G band, then MTN and Vodacom could be left with no spectrum in the bands that is the most important for the future of telecommunication, at least for the next 10 years. And this is, sorry, I must be blunt, this is a little bit crazy, actually. Yeah. So the two carriers that are not only financially the most potent ones, but it simply affect whether you like them or not, that they serve around 70 or 75% of the population. And you deny them of the spectrum that's going to be crucial for the further development of the market. And we're talking about 5G and IoT services. This is inconceivable, basically. There's nothing to say.
Okay, thank you very much. Moving on to a different type of question. It reads, Cell C has denied that they are moving into becoming a mobile virtual network operator, MVNO. But you say they are. What's your take?
So I'm not saying they are. You have to be very precise. So Paul is correct if he says that one has to be careful with such simplifications. Yeah. So I take that point, but the aspect is that Cell C doesn't have a lot of infrastructure anymore. And they do not appear to invest in towers and data centers and radio equipment a lot. They're mostly roaming about the bigger on the bigger carriers network. So the question here is, where does actually, as of when is a carrier a fully fledged carrier, and when is he moving towards, and that's important work, more towards something of an MVNO, which is essentially an intermediary between network services and the client. Yeah. So if MTN, if Cell C sells 90% of the minutes or the data they sell via infrastructure services that are provided by other carriers, then MVNO is not too bad a comparison, though it's not fully fitting. Yeah. So this would be my answer. Obviously, RAIN is not an MVNO because MVNO is an infrastructure provider. So this is a completely different game, and this is why we will never call RAIN an MVNO. They are, yeah. So that comparison would be straight wrong.
Can I come in here just briefly? I think again this is a question of definition. A dynamic market, or what the other Nobel economist Friedrich Hayek called a spontaneous order, is one in which companies shift back and forth in and out of being, focusing on their core business areas, doing deals with each other, sharing. And so precise definitions are always difficult. For example, if you say, what is the precise definition of a pharmacy? Well, it could be anything from one of those that sell, kiddies' toys and pillows and electronic equipment to ones that sell medicine. Do we have to come up with a precise legal definition of what we call a pharmacy, or we call a general dealer? So the answer is no. What we do want is a dynamic market in which clicks or what's the other big one? I should know its name. But anyway, where they move in and out of whatever they supply. And there is no need for a definition. In other words, a dynamic market or spontaneous order doesn't require definitions. You just let people do whatever they wish. If Cell C wants to move out of infrastructure provision, that's okay. You don't define it by the proportion of it that it has. If RAIN chooses not to have any, Vodacom chooses to have a lot, MTN chooses to reduce and do more sharing, well, that's okay. That is exactly what the market should do and not be regulated, and it should be none of our business, anyone on this program. So it should be, that is very important to understand. Markets are not rigid, definitions are not rigid. They ought to be and are dynamic and do change and should change. And so any definition that we have now of a network provider might or might not be, it should be flexible. By the way, if I can just say, Paul has asked many important questions, and and made many important points in the chat section. And some of them I think we're going to have to address. For example, he raises what is the nature of collusion. I think that's an important issue, but something we can't address now, I'm afraid, Paul.
Thank you. Paul, I do see you have your hand raised. Would you like to ask the question?
Yes, I think the crux of my question, that I wanted to focus on has been answered. But I think the main difficulty I have with what is being argued here can be boiled down to a very simple question, which is, why should the regulator not simply conduct an auction in which there are new entrants taking spectrum and we let the market sort it out after the fact? All of the arguments around Coase theorem actually aggravate against allowing, which is what ICASA constantly brings us back to, a situation in which Vodacom, MTN, Cell C and Co are the predetermined participants in the spectrum auction. If there is a pressing, and even if it were to be corrupt, a pressing socioeconomic or political reason why the state wishes to have new entrants, then let that sort of play out, roll the dice. It doesn't really matter what the one line of intervention is, as long as you have a free market after the fact. And if one reads the ECA as it currently exists, if one looks at the Cell C and the RAIN arrangements being made with MTN and Vodacom, it's very clear that any new entrant that has spectrum would be able to do business with them, and we would have a course outcome regardless.
Yes.
So I'm simply not seeing the reason to argue that it is in the consumer interest that we give Vodacom and MTN access to that spectrum directly. If they can't access it directly, they'll access it indirectly.
Yeah, sorry, I think this is not what's being argued, that we say give it to them directly. But I agree, Paul, and I fully agree, we should actually not even have licenses for carriers, because if you don't allocate a license, then they wouldn't allocate a licensed spectrum, obviously. Yeah. So I fully agree that there is no reason to, let's say, allocate spectrum to Vodacom or MTN by preference or because they are big or so. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that spectrum should be tradable, and ideally we shouldn't have even nationally licensed mobile operators, because it's completely unnecessary. Just one example, the internet peering points, the big internet peering points, exchange points through which all internet traffic is intermediated, they emerge spontaneously as non-profit organizations. They continue in Frankfurt, for instance, they continue to be non-profit. Nobody gave them a license. So what this means is that 80–90% of, or at least a very high portion of the internet traffic goes through entities that nobody has licensed, and they are instrumental for the performance of our internet. So this is a very good example that the market creates the solutions that are required when there is demand. It's the same would happen for mobile. I'm also against national licenses and spectrum. Why should me having spectrum in Johannesburg and Pretoria, why should that give me the right to use the same spectrum in Durban? There is no economic reason for this. So Paul, we are probably aligned here.
Great, thanks.
Happy with that, Paul?
Very much so. Very much so. I don't think the regulatory department at Vodacom will be. I think they would like a very different soundbite. It's a very different.
But I can give you an anecdote. So obviously, in my daily consultancy practice, I'm speaking to these people, and they don't like it. That's correct. But if you bring a sound economic argument, yeah, then the regulatory department actually sees a point. It's not that they don't see the theoretical point that a national license is in fact anti-consumer in the long run. They're obviously defending their company's interests, and this is just fine. This is how the world works.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christoph. Just going back to an earlier question about hoarding, I'm just looking for it. You might have seen it, about hoarding spectrum and what happens there in the industry.
Yeah. So the hoarding is one of the let's say writings on the wall when it comes to free spectrum, because what people or politicians fear is that the mighty will just hoard the spectrum without using it. Yeah. So there's two considerations here. First of all, by far the biggest hoarders are governments, and we see that here in South Africa every day. Digital dividend spectrum is just one example, which is almost like a de facto hoarding because it's occupied by benign services, yeah, as are many others. Yeah, so it's being estimated that between 50 and 70% of the spectrum in the sub 6 gig frequency bands are actually idle or underutilized, and these are almost all government owned. So this is the first consideration, and the second consideration is the hoarding doesn't make sense, because imagine that 20 years ago, or maybe in 1995, when Vodacom and MTN were created by allocating 2 licenses, they could have hoarded all the spectrum between, let's say, 700 and 3.5. Would they actually have kept it? Yeah, and certainly they wouldn't, because like 25 years ago, nobody could have seen that 700 can be used for LTE, or that 3.5 would be very important for IoT. So economically speaking, there wouldn't have been a case in 1995 to even hold spectrum in the 3.5 gigahertz band, because it was unutilizable at the time, because the technology, the radio technology, was not yet developed. So this hoarding doesn't make economic sense. It assumes malicious behavior and goes completely against what happens in markets when people economize.
Anything else from you, Leon? Leon?
Okay. I wasn't going to say anything, but since you've prompted me, I think one has to understand that this idea that people hold on to resources purely idly, for example, speculating in land or anything else, artworks or furniture, antique furniture or whatever, vintage cars and that sort of thing, jewelry. The answer is no, they don't. They invest a large amount of capital on which interest could be earned or must be paid. And that is done in order to look forward to enhanced value. So, for example, if somebody holds on to spectrum rather than trades it or uses it, there's a good reason for that. They're not being sacrificial, they're not setting out to harm themselves, they would trade it and they would use it if that made economic sense, and they are always available for being bid up. In other words, somebody could come along and say, I want to use your spectrum, let's do a deal. It's obviously in the self-interest of everybody who has any resource to do such a deal, to increase their revenue from whatever resource they have. That's in the self-interest of all people. And if they don't behave in a self-interested way, thankfully to the rules of economics, they won't be around for very long.
Thank you very much, Leon. I think we're coming to the end of the session. I think we've covered most of the questions in one response or another. If anyone has anything else they would like to say, would they please raise their hand now and let us know? Otherwise, I will close the session and say thank you very much to our author and researcher, Christoph Klein, and to the Free Market Foundation's president, Leon Lowe, and to say that a media release on this event will be with you very shortly, should be in your inboxes any moment. There is also a media briefing paper, a background paper, and there will be a link to that in the release, and also the SEER report itself in full, all 150 pages of it, is on our FMF website, and again the link will be sent to you. If you have any interview requests or any further information you would like, please get in touch with me. I'd be very happy to help. Thank you very much. So the session is now closed.